Hey, everybody, John Marshall back for Oncology Unscripted. If you've been silly enough to fritter away your time with me, we're now on the seventh episode, believe it or not. Goodness gracious, the sponsors of this are crazy to let me keep going. But we do have some really cool stuff to talk about today, and I hope you'll listen in as I review not only sort of what's going on in our world, a little bit of gossip, a little bit of business. We're going to talk about the latest science. But as you remember, this is the third in three parts about the middlemen, the middle people in oncology. And so we've done pharmacy benefit managers, we've done the EMR. Well, the next one is clinical research organization, CROs. So stick around for some discussion about the impact of CROs on us, on clinical research, and maybe are they helpful or not? You'll have to decide after you listen in. But let's start with a little bit of gossip. So if you remember, we talked about PBMs before, and just so happened that the state of Vermont, their attorney general, has sued the pharmacy benefit managers for illegally driving up drug costs. You thought that was just me saying that. No, the attorney general of Vermont also thinks that. Sort of on a business note, too, Karen Knutson, who's a really very prominent member of our cancer community, was, or still is briefly, the CEO for the American Cancer Society and the American Cancer Society Action Network. She has decided to step down. She's going to do a lot more work in that space. So we will be seeing a new ACS leader. I always want to think about the ACS. It is the largest private nonprofit funder of cancer research in the United States. And so we do want to make sure and hold them accountable for their product beyond their journals and the like and what comes out of their science. But I think they've had a great impact over time. So congratulations to Karen, and we look forward to the transitions ahead. Sort of a crazy thing we came across is that, there's a lot more AI in healthcare today, but the NCI just dropped $3.7 million in an effort for AI to predict breast cancer risk and also sort of to try and wrap in health disparities, to try and level that up a bit. But there's another one looking at AI outperforming conventional methods for prostate cancer management. So we're increasingly seeing AI being used, just like every time you drop something in your Google browser, AI being used to try and help us be better at what we do. I do want to give us a bit of an update. There's a really important obit that I'm sure you saw, a guy named Jeff Weber. Jeff Weber was 72 when he died. He actually died of pancreas cancer, but we will know him forever as one of those people who's made a major impact in the world of cancer. His work in melanoma, his work in immunotherapy, frankly, his work as a mentor and making sure that for generations to come, we are going to see that kind of high quality clinical translational researcher, educator, the whole bit. We lost a big one when Jeff Weber died of one of my diseases, sadly, pancreatic cancer. I wish he was working on this one because maybe he would have solved that one. I feel like we let him down, but here's to him and all that he has done and all the lives that he has touched. Just one little bit of business news. You may remember a few episodes back, we talked about sort of the interface about, our industry and how groups are buying other groups, et cetera. Well, I mentioned Florida Cancer Specialist was being looked at by a bunch of different parties. Well, we now know McKesson, I guess, won the bidding for a low $2.5 billion. McKesson bought Florida Cancer Specialists. And then if you think about everything from patient care all the way up the business chain is owned and organized by one group. And so I do think we need to watch this space carefully because are things going to improve? Are they going to get more expensive? Are they going to get more efficient? We really need to see how this kind of structure works because we know more and more of that is going to happen. In fact, I've heard some people predict that not too long from now, the entire United States might be covered by just 10 different health systems. So there'll be mergers and acquisitions up and down the chain so that we'll be just about 10 of us nationwide. We'll see if that comes to fast, but there's the first pass at it with Florida Cancer Specialist and McKesson working together. So let's look at a little science at this point. As you may not know, 34,000 of our closest friends gathered in Barcelona. You ever been in Barcelona? It's one of the greatest cities on the planet. The food is fabulous. The weather is fabulous. The views are spectacular. So if you ever have a chance to go there, go to Barcelona. Well, 34,000 HEMONC docs descended for the annual ESMO meeting. It moves around, unlike ASCO, which is always Chicago. ESMO moves around this year to Barcelona. And I thought it would be useful just to take a few high-level abstracts and make sure you guys have seen these. You probably did, because both the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet Oncology had featured publications with the full articles that reviewed some major new science that was out there. So I encourage you to browse both of those editions, because there's a lot of practice-changing stuff that went in there. But I thought I would actually feature a couple that maybe didn't make it to your front page. So one is a prostate cancer study, and this is where enzalutamide was given either alone or with radium-223. As you know, radium-223 is good for painful bony mets and things like that. So here was the question of what if you put the two together on initial treatment? And the punchline was, it worked. So you got a progression-free survival of 19.4 versus 16. So you got a 3-month bump by combining these therapies. And I think the conclusions of the authors are probably accurate to what we will see in guidelines and the like, is that this will become certainly a new standard option to patients with hormone refractory metastatic prostate cancer. Now, you don't see a lot of stuff around anal cancer, do you? We haven't made much progress in this space in a long time. And we've tried all sorts of different things. Well, we did get one clinical trial, and I'm going to screw the name of this drug up. It's RET, so retifanlimab, basically another checkpoint inhibitor in combination with platinum and carbotaxol in patients with metastatic or inoperable squamous cell cancer. The anus has not been treated with prior chemo. So these are not common. This is a cancer I take care of. So fortunately, we take care of them most of the time. But this study actually demonstrated an improvement in outcome. And related to this, a little bit further north, I don't know, is pembrolizumab plus chemoradiotherapy in cervical cancer. Similar biology, similar risk, chemoradiation treatment, similar, this kind of thing. Well, this study did show an improvement, but here the delta was not so great. So if you added the pembro to the chemoradiation, you got 82.5%, whereas if you just did the chemoradiation, it was 75%. A bump. Most people were cured. The bump was small. Giving everybody pembro for that small bump will be the decision we have to make going forward in cervical cancer patients. Big study, statistically significant. Got to think about the magnitude of the benefit. Is that worth it in these patients? Another one back in the GI space, which I thought was important. We're seeing more and more HCC around the world. We know about lenvatinib, we know about IO therapy here. Well, what about if you gave TACE, so you injected the liver lesions, and gave the lenvatinib and some pembro, so some TKI and IO concomitantly? This was the LEAP-012 clinical trial, and guess what? It was positive. It was positive by 4 months, so 10 months versus 14.5 months. So I expect that we will see that moving very quickly to the frontline setting as well when you're doing TACE early on in diagnosis. Current standard would be TACE alone. Now it's going to be TACE with combo therapy. So that's a good study. That's moving the bar forward in HCC. Breast cancer cannot be left out. Triple negative breast cancer, you give pembro to chemo in patients in the neoadjuvant setting with triple negative breast cancer. Overall survival, of course, it was positive. But here again, 81%, 82% of patients were cured with the old standard. Adding the pembro to this bumped it to 86%. So you got 5 percentage points more. You gave 100 women pembro for those 5 extra, but it's a bad disease. My wife had it. I'm glad she didn't die. 5% may be my wife next time. So we do understand the importance of adding that to treatment. And then the last one I want to talk about is, again, an IO clinical trial they featured at ESMO, durvalumab plus chemotherapy in the adjuvant setting, neoadjuvant setting for bladder cancer. So do you give it before or only after the treatment? And so basically the answer was, by giving it before, you did have an improved events-free and overall survival. So again, I'm expecting that we're going to see more and more neoadjuvant therapy coming in bladder cancer. Clearly a trend in almost every cancer there is out there. So I sadly did not make it to ESMO, but I wanted to bring just a little bite of ESMO to you. I got no beautiful Barcelonan food to offer you and to make you feel more at home, but I hope you one day will go, and maybe not when ESMO is there, maybe just go with your family and have some fun. Let's shift gears now to our middlemen series. And the next area we really want to focus on, as I've mentioned, is clinical research organizations. And I have two outstanding folks that we're going to interview to talk about this sort of from all angles. But I want to just set the stage with a very brief history of what all happened. I've been around since before CROs were really much of a thing. They only came into play really in the 1980s, okay? And this was because the worry is that clinical trials were getting to be more common and that we needed to have our data be cleaner. The FDA was in fact tightening up in some way the way packages would be submitted to them for approval or not. It wasn't just the trial, yes or no, on a curve. You needed to have all of the data in there together, needed to be highly qualified data, good quality data. I'm always joke that even the National Cancer Institute, you would think they could handle this. They went out and got a CRO, and they partner with Theradex, and they have for many years. What the issue here is that the sponsor, somebody who wants to do the trial, needs to get access to that patient who fits their trial. And traditionally, they just needed us, the clinician who did clinical research, to identify and enroll that patient on the clinical trial. But we apparently didn't do a good enough job of maybe managing the data, is really where we got in trouble. We're good at finding the patient, not good at managing the data, maybe, or at least to the quality that CROs, who now get inserted into all of this, will do. They came in as the savior for all of this problem. They said, don't worry, sponsor, we'll find you the best sites. We'll make sure their data is the best. We'll train them, and we'll make sure your package is great. And we will, by the way, add a whole lot of money to the overall cost of the clinical trial. Some say as high as 1/3 of the per patient cost goes to the CRO to manage this. These are for-profit companies. We need to remember this. Trials are going through the roof in terms of numbers of trials, complexity of trials, so that as a result of this too, the value of per patient accrual, so what it costs to put a patient on study, is going through the roof, and it's a competitive marketplace. Back in the day when I was young, you could put a patient on a study for, I don't know, $2,500 a head, and that was enough to do all the data and analysis. Of course, that was old money. New money, you need to add at least 1 0, maybe 2 zeros per patient. And so the cost of one patient on a clinical trial has gone through the roof, in large part due to this additional administrative oversight. So we get analyzed, we get trained, we have to hire up all the people, they hire up all the people to cross-check one another, and it's made it incredibly expensive, so that it's actually made it not very much fun. So I was the associate director for clinical research here at Georgetown for a long, long time. And I just got to the point where this got to be crazy. Even I, as a clinician, didn't like it very much. I was signing forms that said I had to sign a form. Just the burden of documentation was so much. Today, I saw 4 patients on clinical trials, and I was noting that with each one of those, it cost me about 10 extra minutes of documentation to make sure that I had all the data that was needed for the audit and our own people to enter the data, et cetera. And remember back when we were talking about EMRs last week, they're not really built for clinical research, are they? So we have to hand do and then hand enter a lot of the data from clinical trials into some other EMR for the CRO to give to the sponsor. So very, very inefficient. So what do? Like everything else, we offshore it. One of the consequences of CROs has been that the US market can't handle this. And so lots of clinical research is done in parts of the world where they're dying to get on clinical trials, right? We are a rich country. We have access to everything. Lots of places don't. So if they do trials, they actually get that investment there locally and their patients can have access to newer therapies. So we enjoy FDA approvals on the backs of studies done in other countries where the price differential is better for those sponsoring and managing the clinical trial. We need to think about that as we move on the next FDA approval, is that a lot of the work was done by other patients who probably in the end won't have access to the drug that we will have access to. And then the last piece of this is that, you know, the specificness of a patient to enroll into a clinical trial. We already have the precision medicine piece, so they have to have the right gene test, but they also have to have a very good, what we call performance status. Their labs have to be perfect, so much so that the patients who are on trials don't actually represent the patients that we will end up using the drug on. So to get these pristine results, we have to test pristine patients, then apply the drug to the less pristine. And so we have a disconnect there in all of this. And then the last part of this, of course, is the patient interested in participating? Some are, yep, we know that, but we are still well below where we need to be as a nation, as a world, and clinical research, because let's face it, we haven't figured out cancer. We could argue that almost every patient should be on a clinical trial, and yet patients are not really incentivized to participate in clinical trials. And I think actually there needs to be some change in that space too. But enough from my perspective, an old grumpy guy who's kind of a little burned out on the clinical research world. Let's talk to some experts. As we promise for Oncology Unscripted, we bring the best voices, the brightest minds on all of our subjects. And so we are very, very lucky to have Dr. Gwen Bebb join us today. He's the Senior Vice President and Franchise Head and Global Therapeutic Area Head for Oncology from ParXL International, one of our world's greatest CRO institutions. And he's nice enough to join us early in the morning from the West Coast to talk a bit about CROs today. So Dr. Bebb, welcome and thank you for joining. Let me start right in by sort of saying, where are we today with CROs? You know, a little bit about the evolution of that, and maybe even wax poetic a little bit about where we go in the future. I know I've just asked a lot, but fire away. Tell us what you're thinking.
Well, John, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. I was just chatting to one of my colleagues recently, and we were commenting on how protocols for clinical trials have evolved from being fairly simple, you know, maybe 3 or 4 page documents to being the kind of encyclopedic tomes that we see today with many hundreds of pages. And I think that sums up some of the aspects of the evolution of clinical trials in general, which essentially is an increase in the need to be precise about the endpoints, to be precise about the design of the clinical trial, to understand the regulatory body's perspective, to understand the nuances of the endpoints and the measurements that we take in trying to prove that these new treatments are better than what we have. And as a result, I think however innovative and exciting your new molecule or your new therapeutic approach is, and however motivated we are to get these promising new things into the clinic for our patients, there is a very, very important need of maintaining the rigor required to demonstrate that what we are proposing is safe and is going to be better than what we have. And in there, I think, lies all the complexities. And for, say, a small team from an academic institution that has promising data who now want to bring it to the clinic, it is a very daunting prospect to try to conduct a clinical trial in today's environment. So therein, there is an immediate need, if you see, for somebody who has the expertise to run clinical trials. And that in some ways is where the clinical research organizations come in.
Let me jump in there. You know, you and I have watched this evolution occur. So I remember one of my first protocols is, as you say, maybe a 4-page document, and now they're incredibly long. Thinking about the escalation of that complexity, it's multifactorial. The way I think about it is that cancer has gotten more complicated. There's more and more subtypes of patients and the like. The drugs have gotten more specific. So I get an element of complexity there. But we've also started to measure more and more things in order to prove that safety that you talk about. You have the sponsor wanting to get to the patient. Before, that was just through the physician. And now the CRO, because this is this middleman kind of discussion we've been having, the CRO has joined in on this to identify and train and oversee the clinical site. Can you talk a little bit about that piece of it and the importance of that in the overall flow of things?
Yeah, so that kind of sums up a lot of the challenges we have. There's many paradoxes in here. I think the world of clinical trials is so exciting and so promising. Seeing the new ideas that are coming through, gosh, you know, everybody gets very excited and very motivated to bring these to the patient as quickly as possible. But as you say, cancer, as an example, has evolved very much. We have very specific slithers of classification of patients with, for example, lung cancer. It used to be maybe just lung cancer. We have small cell, non-small cell, and then we have all these molecularly defined categories of lung cancer, each with a potential molecular marker that can be targeted for benefit. Now, if you have an agent that it targets one agent, but those patients don't have that marker in their tumor, then we're not going to have an effect. And so including too many patients in a clinical trial that are unlikely to benefit will mask the positive effect. On the other hand, trying to get too specific, maybe it limits the number of patients that you have. Accruing the right number of the required for the statistical design may be challenging. And so these are all components where it is very important to invoke the help of a body of expertise that can help you through the clinical trial trajectory. And that's essentially what clinical research organizations are. When I was a physician, when I ran my own lab, my expertise was very limited to those particular areas. And if I had been lucky enough to bring something to the clinic from my own lab, I would not have been able to do everything that was required to conduct that clinical trial. And that need, you know, I've said it's particularly required for small innovative teams from academia, but the same applies for innovation anywhere. And the same applies for big pharma. They have a lot of internal capabilities, but sometimes whether they're overloaded with their current requirements, whether they're pivoting to a new area, whether they're doing something completely different, sometimes the expertise provided by a clinical research organization, such as Parexel, is exactly the expertise they need to invoke to move things forward. Everything included in that package, where from the identification of the biomarker, all the testing that's required to do that, the clear delineation of which patients is the investigator in the trial going to bring into the trial. How do we meet the regulatory body requirements to make sure that the test we use to identify the patients is a valid and reliable and reproducible one? How can we help design a trial in such a way that it can run uniformly across many countries? How can we make sure that the statistical design is going to meet the criteria required of the regulatory bodies to demonstrate that what we have is better than what we had? And so this is not a range of expertise that you can just pluck out of the air. And, you know, I think that's one of the things that makes me very excited about working for Parexel, is that we have this expertise that can slot into this critical area to drive innovation forward while maintaining the academic rigor required, and of course, most importantly, protecting the interests of the patients who are kind enough to volunteer their time and their bodies in a way to take part in what is a scientific experiment.
I think that's great. What I was going to ask, and you just answered, was sort of your perspective on the value of what the CRO brings to the table. And I think you did a great job of describing that. As you were going to, I want to kind of go to the patient side of things. So one of the worries we have in the clinical side is that the patient who now is eligible for that trial in the end is so perfect, is so squared off at the corners to fit, that that doesn't end up representing the ultimate patient who will be treated with this therapy, because there's, patients are not that clean in general, if you will. So, softening the edges around eligibility for us would be good to increase accrual and also therefore represent that patient at the end. And one other angle on this is, the patient is volunteering. A lot of clinical trials that are not so cancer therapeutic, we've actually ethically understand it's okay to incentivize a patient to go into a clinical trial. We do ask a lot of them. It is extra visits, it is extra time, extra biopsies, sometimes things like that. So they are volunteering their bodies at a sacrifice of some quality of life component. And I wonder what your thoughts are ultimately on, could we get to a place where we are incentivizing that patient? So softening the edges of eligibility, is there a role for incentivization of patients?
Well, thank you very much for bringing that up, because the patient centricity of clinical trials is a very important theme. It is something that we at Parexel are very, very aware of. We have a patient officer who is part of our company, whose task is to maintain a focus on the patient as we look at the design of clinical trial. And as you say, these patients are volunteers. A very important part of clinical trials is the moral and ethical framework for essentially conducting experiments on our fellow human beings. And this is a very, very important area. I have a lot of passion for that. And, the history of experimentation on fellow humans is a terrible one. And so that is why we have international agreements, we have ethical review, an awful lot of regulatory input on how to go about attracting patients to clinical trials. Let's address the inclusivity to start with. I think this is an important point. One of the things I like about clinical trials is the tension that we get when we have slightly opposing forces trying to drive us forward. So as you say, on the one hand, we do want to create the biggest possible chance of deriving the positive signal that we're looking for. And so we have to be very rigorous about the patients that we put in a clinical trial. Otherwise we will lose the positive signal that may be there in a very, very important new therapeutic agent. On the other hand, as you say, we don't want to be too restrictive. There's many, many examples of this. Performance status, for example. Clinical trials have always honed in on performance status 0 or 1, because the outcome that we associate with performance status 2 and 3s can actually compromise the signal that we're looking for. So trying to soften those edges is something that many of the regulatory bodies are trying to drive us forward in doing. Another example, for example, is the inclusion of brain metastases in our clinical trials. Very often it has been the case that patients with brain metastases from their primary cancer were excluded from clinical trials. And we know that that is a very unfortunate paradigm. And I think that too is now evolving and changing. But as we said at the beginning, if you're looking at a new agent that targets a particular therapeutic target, including patients in whom that therapeutic target is not present, is not going to be useful for anybody. It's not going to be useful for that patient, and it's not going to be useful for that clinical trial. Now let's turn to the incentivization of patients. I think this is a very difficult area to navigate very often. And as you say, incentivizing patients is not the main theme of our approach to clinical trials. Many patients, when I was in clinical practice, would ask me, why would I join this clinical trial? And I would say, broadly speaking, there are three reasons for a patient to take part in a clinical trial. One of them is for the opportunity of getting a new, exciting, innovative therapy. That is a very, very good motivation. Another one, I think, is overall, there is a body of literature that suggests that patients participating in a clinical trial generally do better than those who don't. And there's lots of reasons for that. And that is possibly, as you said, the more intense follow-up, the more supervision of their whole clinical experience probably helps drive those data of survival forward. And then the third reason, this is very altruistic indeed. There are some patients who just want to contribute to the general body of knowledge about their disease for those who, as I say, come after them. Now, a very, very important part of this, having looked into their heart and realized what motivates them, the next thing is, if we are patient-centric, we have to make the burden of the clinical trial as minimal as possible. And I think one of the major things that we see happening is that the increased visits, the increased procedures, they don't make your quality of life better, right? They take a lot of time and a lot of energy for the patients. And when it gets to the point where you're missing work, you're missing the opportunity of giving care to those who depend on you, then that is a significant detriment. And so making sure that there is what I've termed fiscal neutrality, for example, in participating in a clinical trial is very important. So there is a drive to make sure that the costs incurred by a patient, whether it's food, travel, care costs, those such things, are very much part of what we provide to make sure that it is not too much of a detriment to the quality of life. I think those things are probably slightly different from actually incentivizing patients to take part in a cancer clinical trial.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gwenbeb, for sharing all of your experience and knowledge around the world of clinical research and the role of a clinical research organization in making sure that we do it right. And we do see the clear value, but as we've talked about, there are still lots of issues that we need to address as we evolve this relationship further. So again, thank you very, very much for joining us on Oncology Unscripted.
Absolute pleasure, John. Thank you for hosting so gracefully.
As I promised you, I have experts in the world of CRO and clinical research, and not just experts, really visionaries about the problem and about how we can move forward. And I'm honored to be joined today by what is becoming a pretty good acquaintance in this world of clinical research. So James Palazzolo is out on the West Coast right now, and he has joined us from Quantum Leap Health. And I'm going to really leave it to James to describe to us the CRO, in a sense, that he and his team has created, in large part response to the problems we have been talking about with CROs. So James, welcome. So you get to tell us whatever you want to say about CROs. Tell us the story and the background of what you've created.
Yeah, thank you, John. So it's an interesting world, right? We all want our medical decisions to be made based on data. And the ultimate way to do that is with a randomized controlled clinical trial in RCT. And as the practice of medicine became more and more data-driven, of course, more and more trials were needed to be conducted. RCTs by themselves are the pinnacle of how this data is collected and the results are generated. But there are some downsides. The downside is it requires extreme precision. Data collection needs to be done in a way that's meticulous. And it creates also a form of a hidebound system where we can only do things one way. And frankly, I think there are alternatives. Alternatives can include things like using game theory, Bayesian statistics, platform trials, master protocols, and the list goes on, decentralized trials, where we can make a long list of innovations. But these new innovations haven't always penetrated the traditional world of the RCT. The RCT is driven heavily by government regulation, but also by the routine of practice. So the people or organizations that conduct these are, usually called CROs. They're professional data collectors and can put that data together for people who wish to have an RCT conducted. The downside, though, is that it really doesn't benefit to have all these innovations over and above what we can provide to RCTs. And so maybe we need a new form of an organization to make that happen. And that's what we've done at Quantum.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that. I mean, part of what the concern is that there's this ever-ending escalation of precision. We can look for more data. If a CRO came and audited us here and found no problems, then that would put them out of a job, right? So part of their essence has to be to find some problems to justify their existence. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you've evolved this for your team.
There's no doubt. So misplaced precision is everywhere, right? We could focus on all the wrong things, but we tried to apply a bunch of newer tools to make this better. So one is we set up a platform clinical trial that once it starts continues to run. So it'd be like if you brought the Olympics to the same city every 4 years, you wouldn't need to build more stadiums. And some people would love that because the public would have access to these things. Other people would hate it. Like if you're in the stadium building job, it would be bad for you. So it's going to depend on where you sit on this issue. In our case, with a platform clinical trial, we can run cancer trials over and over again with the same infrastructure. But that's not all we can do, right? We're also going to listen to veteran clinicians like yourself who guide us into what is the most important. We no longer use misplaced precision, focused on the parameters that are most important. But we're also going to provide these results to patients in plain English in digestible form. So whether you participate in the trial or you're curious about the results, we're going to make them available to everyone. Another thing we've done is put this in a not-for-profit company, so that the company itself isn't doing this. We don't have a vested stake in who wins or loses. We're not looking for the next contract from the next pharmaceutical company. Frankly, we're working with groups of very curious, but also very experienced investigators who want to learn more about their particular area of oncology. And then we're going to grind on that, not just for 2 or 3 years in a trial, but maybe decades, until we find real lasting solutions that make the problem better for the patients who suffer from it.
I want to kind of come back to a couple of things you said. So this idea of having experts be part of the decision making. So I remember, I'm old, right? So I remember back when we were involved in decision making and design of clinical trials and running them. And then something happened where industry actually hired the physicians. So now, instead of borrowing us when it was time to design a trial, everybody went in-house. And so they had their internal experts. And so we no longer were really being asked what our opinion was about a trial or a trial design. But we were being asked just, would we do the trial that's being handed to us? Are we okay with that? I do think that's driven a further wedge between the reality of patient care and this sort of mystical world of precision, data from the randomized controlled trial. So that's one. The second, and I can't help but have this vision of the London Underground and this platform clinical trial. Like, you could be on the London Underground sitting next to Paul McCartney, right? So Paul McCartney would ride the London Underground. Everybody uses the public transportation there in order to get around. It's the most efficient way to do it. You've built, in essence, the Piccadilly line for clinical research that everybody can get on and use if they want to try and lower costs and to improve speed of accrual. Is that a fair analogy?
I think that's absolutely fair. And, if we're going to improve things like racial disparities in medicine, we need a more uniform tool, platform trial where everyone can participate, that of course includes the high-end academic centers where they're going to provide very useful information, but also safety net and community hospitals where everyone has a chance to participate. Of course, it's up their choosing, but if they choose to participate, their data will be included and we'll get more information that allows us to do a better job for everybody.
And so, just so our audience knows, your basic group is supporting, as a CRO in a way, for this platform trial and its relatives, right?
That's right. So our organization provides the same functions to conduct a clinical trial that a CRO would have. If an industry company, a medical device company, or pharma company did some of their trials in-house, they would have these same functions. We have them. But rather than going out and seeking new projects to work on, we built the project with people like you to make sure that it was relevant and reflected current clinical practice, and then continuously improved it over time so that we could enroll patients in trials that more closely reflected their actual routine care and didn't get hidebound in the routine or the tradition of an RCT. It is an RCT, but it is more flexible, and then it collects the appropriate information at the right time.
And we know you guys have been at it a while, and you guys have produced FDA approvals and innovation in how we treat patients in general. You've broken the mold in a way that's allowed us to accelerate our innovation instead of sort of plodding along as we've been doing. So, James, I can't thank you enough for joining us. I know everyone will be interested in hearing more about your success, so be careful. You might get some phone calls after this runs. James, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, John.
I can't thank our experts enough for sharing their thoughts about clinical research, CROs, and maybe some thoughts about how we move forward going ahead, because we need to move forward and we need to make it more efficient so that we can provide better cancer care for people all around the world. And I hope you have found this episode 7 of Oncology Unscripted useful, maybe a little enjoyable, but certainly thought-provoking as you go forward in your week ahead. John Marshall, thanks for joining.